I don't necessarily think the dollar needs anything to back it up. To need to back up the reserve currency is counterintuitive. And so, again, listen, if we get the Bitcoin reserve, and as a guy that owns a lot of Bitcoin, I will not cry. And if you see me crying, there'll be crocodile tears. I think Bitcoin heads to 500,000.
That was Mike Novogratz, the billionaire head of crypto investment firm Galaxy Digital, with some pretty bullish calls on crypto. Bitcoin now trading up over $90,000. Here to discuss more is Anthony Pompliano, the CEO of Professional Capital Management. Anthony, thanks for joining us. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
So are you just as bullish as Mike Novogratz? I mean, yes, he's talking his book, but like, what do you think? What kind of upside do we really see under Trump presidency?
Well, I think there's two stories here. One is Bitcoin in the future without a Bitcoin strategic reserve, and one with that Bitcoin strategic reserve. The interesting thing, though, is other countries now have heard President Trump say that he's going to go buy Bitcoin, and they're now coming out saying, no, we're going to beat you to it. You know, there's still 2 months before President Trump actually gets into office. And I think that's a big deal.
What are the two scenarios then, with or without the SPR for crypto?
I think that Bitcoin will go to low hundreds of thousands without the Bitcoin strategic reserve. If the United States kicks off a global race for countries to start buying this, the interesting thing about Bitcoin is the higher the price goes, the less risky it gets. That's usually not true. Usually in the stock market, the higher a price of stock goes, people get nervous. Could it draw down? What's the issue? Bitcoin started out at 0. And so most investors would say, hey, it's too small. I can't allocate to that. But now that it's 1.5 coming in on a $2 trillion asset class, now these large pools of capital say, wait a second, now this is an investable asset. I can go start allocating to this thing. And so the higher the price goes, the less risky it gets, which means that now we have countries, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks that are yet to still start buying.
Let's take the reserve out of the equation for just 1 second, because I am curious about the regulatory side of this. A big sort of complaint in the crypto community was the fact that they didn't get clear direction and regulation out of the SEC or CFTC, whoever the heck was supposed to be in charge there. And the potential regulations they were going to get were probably too onerous. That risk is removed, right? We pretty much know whoever's going to be running the SEC, the Treasury, CFTC, probably going to be a little bit more friendly. But there are no real regulations in place. So what can they do to make things friendlier, if at all?
Well, one of the interesting things is the U.S. dollar is not regulated either, right? It's an inanimate object. You can't put rules around it, you can't throw it in jail, and you can't find the U.S. dollar. It's a physical or electronic piece of technology. Bitcoin's the same way. What is regulated are the people or the companies that go and transact in, support, hold these assets. And so I think that's really the question. But the nice thing about Bitcoin is it's not controlled by anyone. It's this decentralized network. And so anyone in the world can buy it regardless of what the regulations are. Now, the companies, though, that are needed to actually help support this is where a lot of these questions are. And what I think is really going to end up happening here is we're going to say that Bitcoin is a monetary asset. That asset is treated very differently than all these technology things, because ultimately Bitcoin isn't fundraising. Bitcoin isn't trying to elicit anything. It doesn't have a marketing team. It doesn't have an executive team. There's no board of directors. These other assets, the question is who is centralized versus who is decentralized. And I think you're going to see very, very different rules on that side.
So this is that's a good analogy to use, because we talk about sort of one side of the crypto equation that pretty much is just, as you said, an inanimate object. But some of the things you were referencing were obviously the actual products that people were creating that, you know, to one extent or another, the government had issues with here. Is that still going to be two separate lanes of traffic, or are those going to merge?
I think the big thing that all regulators are trying to figure out is how do we ensure, if the public is putting money into this, that it is somewhat safe, sound, et cetera. Now, one of the interesting things is there's many examples where people operated within that regulatory environment and they still committed fraud, et cetera. So it's not a perfect solution, but it's better than not having a solution. And so on this side with the crypto stuff, I think really the key piece here is if you're going to go out and you're going to fundraise from the public, there's got to be some set of agreed upon rules. And I think the big important part here is that the industry and the regulators didn't see eye to eye. Now, the nice thing is that we have a court system. And so the industry hired a bunch of lawyers, the regulators hired a bunch of lawyers, they went into a court system, and they argued it out. And so far, it seems like the courts are siding sometimes with the industry, sometimes with the regulators. And I think that, unfortunately, is going to be the path to actually getting the regulation, is it's going to be through the court system, because these two sides can't agree. Maybe that changes with new regulatory heads, but that's unclear until we see who those choices are.
So let's go to sort of who's going to be leading all this charge. What do you think about SEC pick? What do you think about Treasury pick?
So far, I think that Donald Trump and his current administration has made a very clear kind of mandate that anyone who is going to work here is going to be crypto friendly. You know, we have somebody who is the first pro-Bitcoin president to go into the White House. He owns Bitcoin. He's supporting Bitcoin. He explicitly promised on the campaign trail he's going to protect Bitcoin and protect people's right to self-custody of Bitcoin. And so I think that when you look at these different choices, it's all going to be good for Bitcoin, right? I haven't yet seen somebody who has been suggested as a candidate for any of these roles that I'm like, oh, that person would be really, really bad for Bitcoin. And I think that in itself is kind of the 0 to 1 win, because I don't think you could say that for past administrations. And so now we have kind of all candidates are going to be pro-Bitcoin. And really, I think that that's why you're seeing so many corporates come in, start buying Bitcoin. You're starting to see Fidelity, BlackRock, Franklin Templeton, et cetera. Everyone is now saying it is time to go buy Bitcoin. And that is a global race.
Now, you interviewed Howard Lutnick in a podcast at the end of October, so before the election, but just a few weeks ago. What do you think? Like, you think he's going to get Treasury Secretary? Like, would he be status quo? It feels like he would be the non-status quo candidate.
I think that Howard is, one, incredibly intelligent. Two, if you're going to be the CFO of the United States, and if you listen to that podcast, what he talks about is using the country's balance sheet to generate revenue in a way that can actually help us cut taxes. I think it's a very novel idea. It's something I hadn't heard before. And so having somebody who knows how to make money is probably a pretty important thing if that's going to be your strategy. And then the other thing that I could speak specifically to Howard that I think is really interesting is he's a family man, and you want somebody in government who can handle crisis. You want somebody who can handle kind of uncertainty. And understanding his story around 9/11 is one of the most powerful stories of resilience that I know of in American business history. And so I think that people hear that story and they say, hey, this guy would be a really good pick. Now, I don't know many of the other candidates, but from everything that I've seen online, they also would be really good picks. And so in a weird way, people want to position this competition between, Lutnick and the other candidates as like some sort of like house of cards. There's a bunch of backstabbing, et cetera. Maybe that's going on, maybe it's not. What I tend to think is that there's so many good candidates for President Trump to pick from that he's trying to get it right and make the perfect pick. And so let him take his time, right? Let's not rush it. This is going to be a really important role. Obviously, markets are very interested in who's going to run the Treasury. And so let's see who ends up being the right pick for Trump and his administration.
All right, well said, Pomp. I'm going to leave it there. Anthony Pompliano, CEO of Professional Capital Management.